well, we don't really need that, but so the organization that does this work is called Taboo Media, and I founded it with actually one of my former students. Brian Pellet was a student in journalism, and Brian went on, he became a Marshall Scholar, so he got a master's at Oxford University and was working in free speech and First Amendment um, efforts. And then he decided to move to South Africa. So Brian is based down in South Africa, and we decided to go ahead and do this work. Really, Taboom works at trying to dispel all sorts of taboos in the media, but right now we do focus on LGBTQ rights because it's really an urgent need, and it's really, in many cases, can be life or death. It's a huge human rights issue all across the globe, really, but where we do our work in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, it is an issue. Um, in the work that we do, we use teams of trainers, and we use both local journalists and people who work with NGOs, and then the journalists that we train are selected in a competitive process. So we get very high caliber journalists. They're sometimes work for the BBC or Reuters. And then we also get journalists who work for local or national uh, outlets. Our trainees so far have come from 30 different countries. Of course, South Africa. Most of our trainings are in South Africa, but we have also done done trainings in Zimbabwe. Last fall, we did trainings also in Malawi, and this fall, I don't know if it's going to happen depending on the coronavirus, but we are set to go to Zambia. Again, I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But we've had trainees from all over: Botswana, Congo, Senegal, Mozambique, Kenya, Nigeria, Gabon, and Uganda. So it's really quite a diverse group. And our funding comes from, we work with, for instance, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is a German-based foundation, but they have significant offices in Johannesburg and Cape Town. We work with like the European Journalism Center, which does provide funds for us. And then we also have funding from some US private foundations. Whoops. So some of the challenges that we see in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is not unique really to these countries. We see these challenges in other parts of the world as well. But there is a lack of professional journalism schools. So there aren't professional journalism schools where the journalists will learn ethics or accuracy or bias. They don't learn about how to report on issues that are not, on issues that they might have strong views on. When you go to a professional journalism school, you learn how to do that and how to be fair in your reporting. But a lot of the journalists over there, they don't have that opportunity because those schools of journalism just don't even exist. And then there also are strongly religious cultures in many of these countries, and with religions or aspects of religions, different religions that are critical of LGBTQ people. And so it's very hard for the journalists to see worldviews that are different from this environment and this culture. We also know that there are a lot of ministries that send a lot of money to some of these countries, and they proselytize certain viewpoints. And many of them are anti-LGBTQ attitudes, and many of these are coming from the United States. There's a lot of money that comes from the United States through religious ministries, Pentecostal mostly, and evangelical ministries, and they will bring schools and hospitals and many kinds of services and things that are often in need and welcomed, but then they also will sometimes bring strongly anti-LGBTQ attitudes, and sometimes work with governments to keep criminalization strong in some of these countries. One of the things that we also deal with and we also see, of course, many of these countries have colonial heritages, which complicates the views towards homosexuality there. So there is a view that it's a Western phenomenon and that it doesn't exist naturally in sub-Saharan African cultures. And so it is something that then gets rejected as an effort to reject Western influence. And that view is quite powerful in many places. Then in some of these countries, there are some still very high rates of AIDS and a perception that AIDS is a gay disease that has been introduced by racist cultures. Now, statistically, actually, the growth in AIDS in sub-Saharan African countries is among women primarily, so but heterosexual women, but nonetheless, there is still this perception, and it's used, it's weaponized as a way to be anti-LGBTQ. And then, of course, many of the religious leaders there are also use anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, sometimes to gain power or to stay in power or to gain income revenue from other sources. It becomes very complicated, but we've seen this in a number of countries from some of the political leaders. And then finally, my area, what I specialize in, there is a lack of religious literacy. And so the lack of religious literacy means that people of faith and others within a culture are not able to really contextualize religious interpretations that come in from outside groups. And so they're not able to understand that, for instance, not all Christians oppose LGBTQ rights, that there are many religious groups that support LGBTQ rights, for instance, and there's a whole range of viewpoints from strongly opposed to strongly accept, and that it's not an either or sort of reality when we're talking about religious viewpoints. So again, just to give a little bit of context in terms of why one of the reasons that we do this work right now in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a survey that comes from an international LGBTQI organization. This data is, they did global surveying. It was a very expensive, wide-ranging survey, so it's from 2016 because they can't do it frequently. But what they asked is the question of, is same-sex desire a Western world phenomenon? And what we can see is that there are a lot of differences in attitudes. So in terms of strongly agreeing or somewhat agreeing with that statement, in African countries, about 47% on average, that's averaging all the different countries, agreed that, either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed, that same-sex desire is a Western world phenomenon, and about 30% disagreed in some way, and about 30% neither disagreed or agreed. That percentage is pretty similar when you look at Asia. In the Americas, that's North, South, Central America, 21% agreed that same-sex desire is a Western world phenomenon, and 38% disagreed. And similarly, in Europe, it's 24% agreed. Oceania, which includes Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, so on, was 20% agreed that same-sex desire is a Western world phenomenon. So we can see, and then if you look to the right of this chart, you can just see some of the differences of views in some of these countries. We'll get to this in a minute, but South Africa is the only country where same-sex marriage is legal. And so consequently, you will see when you look at the stats for South Africa that they tend to be much more accepting of LGBTQ rights. And then this survey didn't survey every country, so it only did a sample in these particular countries. And these are not all sub-Saharan countries, obviously. So, so when you look at that statistic for Africa, it does include the entire continent. It's not just where we do work in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and then in terms of the question of whether or not being LGBTQI should be a crime, overall, if you look at somewhat agree and strongly agree, outside of South Africa, it's pretty strong in terms of it should be a crime. And it is criminalized in quite a few of these countries. I couldn't go through every single African country and tell you the status of whether it's criminalized, not criminalized, but because I don't work in Northern African countries. But in many of the sub-Saharan African countries, it is still criminalized in the form of sodomy laws. I know there's a lot of numbers here, so but I'm gonna move on. And then this question is: would you be upset if one of your children told you that they were in love with somebody who is LGBTQI? And what we see is quite a variation of, with the darkest purple is people who would not be upset. The middle is somewhat upset, and then on the far right, that lightest lavender color, people who are very upset. And we can see that in Africa, in African countries, it's well over half, 62% would be upset. And I can talk about some of the questions and myths that come up in our trainings, some of the attitudes, and where some of these attitudes come from in some cases. So, and then this is a kind of a map that shows you where the status of things are in terms of rights. And this map doesn't label every single country. I had to go ahead and label they didn't all have their names, so I had to put the names in for all those countries. So I'll just be honest, it got tedious. So so I stopped at some point and didn't label them all. But nonetheless, you can see that some of those countries, there is still an enforced death penalty. Of course, Uganda has had attempts to have enforced death penalties. Tanzania and Uganda, you have life imprisonment. You have prison in quite a number of these countries. Again, not necessarily sub-Saharan African countries, but you do still have countries like Sudan where they have prison sentences. In most of the northern African countries, you do have you have sodomy laws in which it's if you are caught in a having same-sex relations, it is punishment by prison. There are some places where it's illegal, but they don't really enforce it. And then other countries where it's legal, but it's not really recognized in any way. And then same-sex marriage is legal in South Africa, which I believe was the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. So as some of this data shows, of the 54 African countries, 33, or about 61%, do still criminalize same-sex relationships via sodomy laws. That's how a lot of these laws came to these countries, were via colonial era laws coming from primarily England at the start. I believe sodomy laws had their origin in England. And there are some discrimination protections in 7 of the 54 countries. And then, as I mentioned, gays and lesbians can adopt and get married in South Africa, but only in South Africa. You know, sometimes people aren't always aware of some of the consequences of these views. A lot of these are not necessarily legal views. They're more what we would call sort of social hostilities or health problems or other kinds of issues. So in speaking to public health people, for instance, in some of these countries, it's very hard to get people to talk openly about if they are having relationships, same-sex relationships. There might be particular health problems that occur or are potentially occurring, but if there are stigmas that prevent them from being open and talking about these problems, it's very hard for public health people to then treat the issues. So sexually transmitted disease, not SDTs, STDs, that should be, AIDS and other sexually contracted diseases. So this is a challenge for public health workers. Okay. So abandonment and shunning is very common. One of the things that a lot of people don't know happens is what we call quote unquote corrective rape. So if a woman believes that, or if a family believes that a woman is a lesbian, the pastor or somebody in the family will force them to have sex, will rape them. Sometimes it's a brother or an uncle, sometimes it's the pastor. But this is actually, sadly, a rather common thing to occur in some places. And the belief is that if a woman has sex with a man, then she will not want to have sex with a woman. Some of the religious organizations will promise families that they can pray the gay away, or they will do exorcisms, other kinds of activities to try to change somebody's sexual orientation. And it's really a way of exploiting these families and taking advantage of them. Let's see. Obviously, you know, beatings, arrests, murder are also occur fairly regularly. One of the things, one of the issues when we talk about LGBTQI, some people say, what does the I stand for? So we don't talk about it much in this country about intersex babies, but whenever we do these trainings in sub-Saharan Africa, there is an interest in intersex people, individuals. And intersex individuals are people who are born with genitals that are ambiguous, that may have from both genders. They may have missing them. There may be other kinds of physical attributes that make a gender determination a challenge for physicians or families. And so in some cases, unfortunately, these babies are killed in the more rural areas. Another aspect, I remember talking to a trans woman in Zimbabwe, and it is not legal for her to get the hormones that she needs to complete her transition. And so as a result, this can really mess up your health in a lot of different ways. It also encourages the purchasing of hormones through mail order from unknown sources, or sharing of hormones, so taking them at lower levels, lower dosages, or getting them illegally. So there's just a lot of challenges for trans men and women in societies where there are huge numbers of stigmas, or where it is criminalized. And it probably goes without saying, but obviously there are a lot of mental health and emotional trauma related to anti-LGBTQ views. So this is a journalist named Carl Collison. He's just a fabulous writer, worked for the Globe and Mail in Johannesburg, and he was a fellow. He was funded by a foundation, and he was funded for 2 years to work at the Mail and Guardian and to write stories about LGBTQ individuals. And so this is one story he wrote in 2018 about intersex babies. And again, he's a very talented journalist, and was actually able to find people to talk about this problem there. So my area as a journalist, I mean, for really my whole career, last 35, 40 years, I focused on religion and news, religion and the media. And so one of the reasons that we deal with religion when we're talking about LGBTQI issues in sub-Saharan Africa is that there are a number of high levels of religiosity in sub-Saharan Africa, both predominantly Christian countries and predominantly Muslim countries. And it's going to continue to be that way for decades to come. So even though we talk a lot about the decline of religion in the West and in the United States or Western Europe, that trajectory is not the reality in most of the world, in fact. And that's particularly not the trajectory or the estimate for religiosity in sub-Saharan Africa, in Central America, and in Asia. So there are many parts of the world where religion is growing. And this just is a chart. This is from the Pew Research Center. They have the best statistics about religion and religious beliefs in the world, really. They have phenomenal methodologies, and it's very high caliber data. So if you look at the left, the left shows you in 2016 the estimated share of global Christian population. So right now you can see that in North America, Canada, that's Canada, the United States, and you have about 12% of all Christians across the world live in the United States. About a quarter of them live in Europe, another quarter in Latin America and the Caribbean, and a little over a quarter live in sub-Saharan Africa. Northern Africa, of course, are predominantly Muslim countries. When you go to 2016, these are estimates, but they base them on things like birth rates, population growth rates, and so on. When they do that, we can see that in sub-Saharan Africa, the projections are that 42% of all Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a huge change. And that's not necessarily because the number of Christians is going down. In fact, the number of Christians will go up. It won't go up as high, it won't grow as fast as the number of Muslims in the globe, but Christians will continue to grow, and eventually 42% will live in sub-Saharan Africa. If you know anything, if you belong to, say, the United Methodist Church, you probably know that within a few years, there'll be more United Methodists in sub-Saharan Africa than there are in the United States. And that it's a large US-based denomination. Okay. Oops. So this same growth is occurring within Islam as well. So this is a little bit different way of visualizing things, but if you look at 2015 on the far left of this chart, of this graph, you'll see that most Muslims right now, 61% are in Asian and Pacific. So for instance, Malaysia, Indonesia, particularly Indonesia, has more Muslims than any other country in the world. And so that's where 61% of Muslims are. India, China, all these countries have far more Muslims than, say, Saudi Arabia. I mean, largely because they're just large population countries in part. So the stereotypes, however, don't indicate that, but that's the reality in terms of statistics. So, but those numbers are going to decline in Asia Pacific, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the number of Muslims, the percentage of Muslims across the globe are going to grow from about 16% now to 27% by 2016. The percentages will stay quite static in Europe and also North America and Latin America. And it says 0, but that's just because it's such a small percent of the global Muslim population. I think there's something like 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. That might be off. It might be off a little bit, but you know, the United States has possibly 6 to 7 million Muslims, but it's still a relatively very small percentage compared to other parts of the world. So again, so what we're seeing is a continent where religiosity is going to grow, both among Muslims and among Christians. So I just want to check my time, and I think we're doing fine. Let's see. So I want to just talk briefly about why do some religious groups oppose LGBTQ rights. And it's overwhelmingly, I would say, it's a result of biblical interpretations. There are passages, mostly in the Old Testament, and so those passages would be the ones that Christians and also Orthodox Jews, for instance, or some Christians, I should say, and some Jews, and also similar stories that are in the Quran that are used primarily to argue that God opposes LGBTQ rights. So one of those stories is Sodom and Gomorrah. Sometimes you'll also hear pastors say, well, God created Adam and Eve. He didn't create Adam and Steve. So the creation story sometimes will get used. There are passages about men lying with men as a prohibition in the Old Testament. And then for Christians in the New Testament, there are some books that are authored by the Apostle Paul, or are credited to being authored by the Apostle Paul. So books of Timothy, some passages in Romans. And these passages also are interpreted as being anti-LGBTQ rights, or LGBTQ people, or same-sex relations. We also know that in some cases, some of the most popular biblical translations are translations that were done many decades and even centuries ago. Sometimes they don't include the more modern scrolls that have been found. We're constantly finding new sacred scrolls and using them to date them and to compare them with the scrolls that already are in existence. So this all has to do with biblical translation work and biblical, biblical studies kinds of scholarship that goes on. And then finally, I just want to mention that none of these passages mention women. The biblical passages, the Quranic language, they don't, well, the Sodom and Gomorrah mentions women, but they don't mention women in same-sex relationships, and particularly in the New Testament. And so I mention that only because regardless, these attitudes are prevalent both against men and women, and bisexual individuals and transsexual individuals and so forth. So so these are just some of these are I would say the primary reasons that understanding sacred scriptures and the interpretation of them is a huge issue when it comes to human rights in regard to LGBTQ people. So some of you, particularly if you're from Uganda, are familiar with this story. You may be familiar with this story. So this is an example of, this is probably one of the most extreme examples, I would say, of an individual. His name is Scott Lively, and he is a pastor who has very strong anti-gay attitudes. He had an anti-gay conference in Uganda, and he was working and really supporting the Ugandan government to institute a death penalty. And he eventually was kicked out of Uganda, but this is just, one small example. I use him even though this is a little bit old. I use it because he was such an extremist in these views. In many cases, it's not nearly so overt as it is in the case of Scott Lively, but he still has a ministry and he still operates a ministry. He just can't go back to Uganda physically. Of course, it doesn't prevent him from broadcasting. Many of these individuals have very strong radio ministries, particularly, and some of them have television, but radio is more common. And so where they still preach the same rhetoric. So I want to get into just a couple little case studies then before we take questions. And I just want to mention that one of the things we do besides training is that we do media monitoring. And so I'm going to take a quick sip here, just a second. So what we do is we try to document examples of where reporting goes a little bit off the rails, where there are problems with terminology, or where the sourcing is very limited and only includes, say, one side or the other, or where a reporting includes myths or stereotypes, or where somebody gives a name of somebody who's a source when they shouldn't have and puts that person into danger. Because in some of these countries, it is very dangerous for LGBTQ people to speak to journalists. Or where there's problems with visual imagery, and I'll show one example of that. So we rate the articles, we rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, and then when needed, we contact the authors or the news outlet and try to educate them on ways that a story could have been written that are more fair and more balanced and more accurate. So this just gives you a list of all the different kinds of problems that we might find in a story. So we might find a story that is fair and balanced and objective. That's the goal, right? Usually we don't find that so often. More often we'll see one that maybe shows bias, it shows fear-mongering, so you should be afraid of gays because they're all pedophiles. You'll see an example of that here in a minute. Where the terminology is inaccurate or it's being misused, either on purpose or by accident, where somebody just doesn't understand the terminology and doesn't realize they're using it poorly. Then, we look at whether or not LGBTQI voices are sufficient or are they insufficient. Are there negative myths and stereotypes that are being challenged, or are they left unchallenged? Are they being reinforced? And then other kinds of things, is the research or the context that's included in the story, is it factual or accurate? Is it sufficient or not sufficient? Is it false? Or is it false and negative? Is that the only thing that you see in terms of the context or the research that was done? Was source safety considered? So is there a line in the story that says so-and-so's name was changed to protect them, something like that? And then how are the visuals and the photos that are included? We know, as they say, pictures speak 1,000 words, and I do think that's still very much true. And yet, how are LGBTQI people portrayed in visuals, in photos? And are they always demonized, or are they always angelic? We want it to be accurate. That's what we want it to be. So this is a very peculiar headline because it's a little misleading. It makes it look like they're calling these priests and cardinals, that they're calling these cardinals pedophiles, but that's not the case of this story. But it was the case, and that is often the case, that the Catholic Church will encourage anti-LGBTQ marches. So that's what we have here. That's an example of this. And this came from The Nation in Lagos, Nigeria, in 2013. So this is one of the issues that, just the equivalent of LGBTQ individuals and pedophiles. It's a huge problem, huge problem in the news. These are some of the ways that gays and lesbians can be described or might be understood in a particular story. So they were referred to same-sex relations as sexual perversion. They will talk about influential homosexuals are sexually abusing young boys and initiating them into the bestial practice. So that's very common suspicion that gays and lesbians, quote unquote, recruit people and then make them become gay. That's very, very common attitude. But you can see in some of this other language, warped moral behavior, you know, easy prey for homosexuals and pedophiles, and ravenous homosexuals, this idea that all gays are just, all they want is sex, sex, sex. And then hunting for the innocent children and devouring them at will. In this case, they're talking about a sort of a euphemism, I guess, for sexual devouring or what, but at any rate, nonetheless. And then they use the word unwholesome practice, despicable act, and again, pegging it to wealthy and influential men in the society. And that's all just one article. So
there's a lady who has a question. Her name's Elizabeth, and she has to leave in 10 minutes. I don't know if you have time to answer her.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm almost done. So
okay, that's what I told her.
Yep, we're almost done. So let's see. This is another example of a story with all these gay guys who will marry our girls. So this was, these were some elders who were, I think.
That's Kenya.
Kenya, yep, it's a Kenya paper. So the elders are worried that nobody will marry the women. Another real concern that I have heard is that how will we continue, our humanity continue? Because how can gay couples have children? And these kinds of things. Again, very common kinds of attitudes. And finally, I think this is my last example. This is in Malawi. This was a trans woman who obviously was in the process of a transition. And what the police did was they arrested this woman and arrested her bare-chested. So I put that little blue box there, but the newspaper itself actually showed this trans woman's breasts. And you know, that's obviously a terribly dehumanizing and horrendous sort of human rights violation for this trans woman. This was on the front page, by the way, of this Malawian newspaper. And that was from 2017. So again, these aren't from 10 years ago. They're in the last few years. And I mean, almost every day you could pick up a paper and find problems in it. No, even in South Africa. And then finally, this is an older copy. This is from, this was covered by the Guardian. So this was a copy of a newspaper from 2010 by the Guardian, London, where a Ugandan paper was calling for gay people to be hanged. And, you know, you have headlines like Top Homos Leak, and with pictures of, and accusing individuals of, you know, so 100 pictures of Uganda's top homos. You know, I mean, very offensive language, offensive terminology, and also just bridging huge human rights, personal privacy violations as well. So let me just check. Yeah, so I'm almost done. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll take this off of the presentation here and go back to my, let's see, stop share. Okay, there we go. So let me just check if I can see here who is.
There's an Elizabeth.
There's a Linda Journey trying to get
Yeah,
in.
let her in,
All
because
right.
I told her it was locked, but there's also Elizabeth
I'm on
Kaganda
audio.
or Lizzie. Lizzie, are you on your phone?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I didn't know who that was. Okay. Deborah, I can't hear you. You have to do that little button.
There we go. So what I was going to say is we do training on various things, on religious literacy related things, and how the Bible is put together. Other talking to people who talking to religious groups that support gay rights. And offering other kinds of understandings of stories such as Sodom and Gomorrah, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the things that we train people on, as well as terminology, not using words like homo and things like that. What is proper terminology? So I will go ahead and unmute everybody, and we will, let's see. And let's see, there we go. So now all the participants are unmuted, and you can go ahead and ask questions. And I'm here for until 1:30, so. Oh, you're muted, Jennifer, just a minute. Let me see, unmute, there we go. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, so can I be the first?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it because I have to declare I've worked with Tanzania Commission for AIDS, and one of the things or projects that we were doing was issues pertaining LGBTI and the HIV transmission per se.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, out of your paper, first of all, I have a question. Is it possible to share your presentation or the paper that, like the report by itself that you wrote? Because I would love to, read it. But two, during the course of even my work, I've done that kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
We realize that there are challenges, especially to reporters or journalists. They usually interview one side. So they will interview the victims. They will interview, like gay people, or they will interview, like anyone who falls under LGBTI. But what they don't realize, which I think if we really want to help these people, not only reporting, but we need to also interview or, learn a little bit from traditional leaders, because, all these, it has to do, yes, there's, there's religion, but there's culture issues.
Yes.
And also asking, like the doctors, because I can give you an example. At one point in Tanzania, I'm from Tanzania, by the way. So
Yeah.
at one point we had a report that was saying otherwise about the people who, like the treatment of people who are gay. But we went, because we are government, but we went forward to see, like, really, are the doctors discriminating these people? So we got an opportunity to also interview the doctor. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, in your report, did you at one point also consider, like, talking to people like traditional leaders, or, religious leaders, or doctors, or medical, health workers who are dealing with LGBTI people, because there are some clinics that only provide services for LGBTI.
Right.
Lawmakers, because you mentioned that in some countries, of course, you mentioned Uganda, that is applies in like Tanzania too. You
Correct.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it is criminalized and it is an offense. So, but why so? I mean, and I know there's Human Rights Watch that they wrote a report, but also the report was kind of biased in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I'm always curious to know if you have looked at the other side, because there's also a lot on the other side.
Yes.
That's my
Yeah, so I appreciate that. That's really great comments and great questions. So we always do one training in in Cape Town specifically, and another training then in other countries. So when we train in South Africa, one of the reasons we do trainings there is that there are a number of religious leaders, and including and there are traditional healers. In this case, we work with traditional healers rather than, say, tribal elders or tribal leaders. But we do work with the healers and always have them speak to the journalists so that they can explain their viewpoints and how they deal with these human rights issues. There also are a lot of religious leaders that are supportive of gay rights as a human right in South Africa. So for instance, one of the very few open gay imams is in Cape Town.
Mm-hmm.
Very unusual and very rare to have a gay imam be publicly gay imam, but one of them does live in Cape Town. And so there are a lot of, like there's something called the Inclusive and Affirming Ministry, and there are a lot of religious organizations in South Africa that do support human rights, and specifically human rights of gay and lesbian individuals. When we did our training a couple years ago in Zimbabwe, we did include a public health worker. Actually, she's a health educator, a very high level health educator, who has been really active in trying to open up the government toward more, being able to talk freely and openly about sexually transmitted disease, about AIDS and things like that. For instance, in places like Zimbabwe, it's illegal for a physician to write prescriptions for hormones for a trans man or woman. So it's illegal for the doctor to do that. Well, so, in some places, some of these countries, efforts to provide health services from the outside will come with stipulations that you have to be able to ask these questions, or you have to be able to prescribe medicines that individuals need for transition or for hormonal purposes or whatever. So I know that it's a very fluid state, and there are a lot of different influences, but I do think the most effective influence is money, and at least on the politicians, for politicians who are anti-LGBTQI, those politicians often are very much influenced by outside money, and sometimes that outside money is coming from religious groups that hate homosexuals, and sometimes that money's coming from countries that are trying to open things up in terms of human rights. So it is a very complicated problem, and as you say, the culture is a real challenge. When we did trainings in Malawi last year, we talk about myths, and one of the journalists at the end of this training said, you know, and we had just had some activists who work as openly gay men in Malawi. And, you know, they've spent time in jail, they've been beaten and so on and so forth, but they still are open. And we had them speak to the journalists. And afterwards, at the end of the training, one of the journalists said, you know, I didn't used to think that there was such a thing as gays and lesbians. But now I'm going to see if I can find some. That's his language. But I mean, that's in places where it is so closeted and there are so many challenges to being out, challenges with being shunned or losing your family or what all, you know, it's hard to, it takes time. It takes time, and you know, a training here and there is not enough. We have to keep on with it and keep doing it more and more. But if we can train the journalists to at least use proper language and to at least try to have diversity of viewpoints, it's always the goal in their stories. So the terminology and diversity of viewpoints, that's among the most important things that we can do. And those are all principles of being a good professional journalist.
There's another question.
Okay.
Thank you.
From Yanu. Yanu, do you want to ask it or do you want me to? Okay. Is there any relationship between the demographic characteristics and their support to LGBTQ in African country respondents? I guess he's talking about the survey. And then he says, perhaps the higher the citizen education level or income would increase their support to LGBTQ rights, question. Or is it mostly due to the religious reasons? Thanks.
I mean, religion has an outsized role here, I think. We know that, so for instance, in Malawi, I want to say something like 93% of Malawians are Christian and are very actively Christian, right? So that's a huge percentage. That's almost unanimity in terms of the country. Now, there is certainly religious diversity. I know when we were in Lilongwe, and then we were in Blantyre, and in Blantyre I know they had a Hindu temple. You know, they have many different kinds of Christian entities. They have had a mosque. So, but nonetheless, 93%, that's huge. So religion does definitely play an enormous role. And the two religions that play the biggest role in these cultures is Islam and Christianity. Now, in terms of, I wasn't quite sure I understood the demographics question. The thing is about, I don't think we really have good data as to how many people are gay and lesbian or LGBTQI in sub-Saharan Africa or in any global context, I think, but particularly in countries where there are a lot of stigmas to being open about your sexual identity. So I don't believe we have good numbers that would say, oh, well, X percent of people in Uganda are gay versus X percent of people in Kenya or X percent of people in Angola. I mean, I don't think we don't have that data as far as I know. It's all really on an estimation kind of a basis based on common assumptions about what percentage of people in the general population fall into one of those categories of let's see, I think I answered that question.
Yes, thank you, Anne. There's a George. He would like to ask 1 or 2 questions.
Mhm.
He's in the.
Thank you for your presentation. Admittedly, it is a very complex issue.
Yeah.
With a lot of myths, a lot of falsehood as well, and a bit of ignorance. So my first comment really is related to your data. If you look at your, I think your survey, the first 2 questions, right, and you disaggregate that into regions. For example, North Africa, the dynamics are much different from the rest of Africa.
Right.
So you will realize that if you take Algeria, Egypt, and Morocco together,
Right.
their mean is below 25.
Yeah.
Right. And if you remove those from the rest,
Yeah.
it also means the rest of the group goes up. So the dynamics are really very different depending on the region. And then the second thing is to do with a lot of ignorance. And I think primarily it's because people just ask one side.
Mm.
And often it is the activists. And their views may not be consistent with the correct legal position.
Yeah.
If I look at Zimbabwe, for example, what the law forbids is sodomy.
Right.
Only. Right. So, and by its definition, sodomy is anal sex.
Yes.
Right. According to the law.
Right. That's right.
So it forbids that. So automatically it excludes lesbians. Right. And then when it comes to gay men, right, the challenge is you have to have one party reporting that they were sodomized.
Right.
So practically, it is not outlawed.
Yeah.
It becomes problematic if someone tries to do it publicly. But again, that is outlawed in most countries. For example, public display of affection, even in the US, would attract a penalty. So there is an element of ignorance on that.
Yeah.
As for the rest, the only thing that's specific according to the law is number one, marriage between same-sex couples.
Yes.
That the law forbids.
Yes.
And number two, adoption of children by same-sex couples.
Right.
That the law prohibits. So again, it's a very complex issue, but you have to be very granular in the way you look at it and avoid the temptation of overgeneralization.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely, you're right. And just to mention that the data that I used is not actually my data, but it comes from an international group that looks and gathers data on LGBTQ rights. But you're absolutely right that yes, that when you remove Morocco and Egypt and Angola, that when you or Algeria, I think it was, when you remove those countries, that the data could look quite different. And so yes, you're absolutely right there. And then of course on the issues of the law, I think that what's a bigger problem than the actual laws themselves are really just social hostilities as well as misuse of the law. So, you know, or misinterpretation of the law, or just law, you know, police officers who aren't being ethical in how they apply the law. So certainly those things occur everywhere. They occur in the United States. They occur in every country. But in some of these locations, the issues that the people who are being most affected maybe belong to the LGBTQI community, as opposed to, you know, here in the United States, it's race-based, right? We have racial inconsistencies in how police officers will sometimes deal with African Americans or people of color. So, but yes, you're right. It's a huge problem, and part of it is because the journalists, the police officers, the politicians, they're all part of the same culture, and if anti-LGBTQ rhetoric is readily repeated in the news outlets and within the population as a whole, then it's very hard to battle that. It's sort of swimming upstream constantly on the part of activists or journalists or others, you know, or ethical police officers or ethical politicians who are trying to guarantee human rights for all in their specific culture and country.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah, and for everybody who's participated today. I think it was pretty. I learned a lot today, and I really appreciate and value the work you're doing. And keep up the good work. And like to learn more about your work. And Deborah, your media outlet is called Taboom Media.
Taboom Media, it's really a training organization, but I think there's still a question from Abdul Rashid. Yeah. Let me see if I can.
Oh, let's see. Yeah, it says.
I can unmute. Oops. No.
Okay.
Let's see if I can unmute him. Yeah. He should be.
Yeah, he's okay now. Okay.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question, I wanted to ask about, you know, with regards to the whole aspect of LGBT rights being represented in the media and whatnot. In this day of age of social media, we have a lot of online social media activism with regards to LGBT rights and whatnot. There was an issue very recently, I don't know if you heard about it, but CNN had this expose about this Ebla Russian disinformation network that had sort of tried to brand itself as these social activist media accounts, and they were, one of them was the LGBT Rights Ghana Twitter account. So how in your in the work that you do you make sure that, so okay, the thing is you don't know whether this was actually a legitimate LGBT rights activism account or if it was part of this disinformation network as CNN reported, but with regards to you know, the genuineness of these online activism accounts, and you know, they become outlets for a lot of media posts for the movement and all sorts of things. How do you make sure that it's not hijacked by other players, as was reported? How do you make sure that these people, because I mean, social media accounts cannot be regulated. You cannot have a monopoly on the movement and say you are allowed to do this, you're not. But people are still doing it. People feel like their voices need to be heard. They're out there trying to push for change and whatnot. And it became a really big issue because now a lot of people didn't know whether they could trust this account. I know the account got suspended, but it has been unsuspended now. It's how do you manage all of this? How do you make sure that in doing what you're doing, you're also making sure that you are trying to push a certain level of legitimacy with regards to a lot of the work that is being done out there?
Right. So, so particularly in a lot of the countries that we work in, the problem is WhatsApp. So WhatsApp will have, there'll be a lot of propaganda that will be shared via WhatsApp, because WhatsApp use is very common and popular. We try to include, we do trainings of various lengths, but the preferred length we try to do is a week-long training. And when we do the week-long trainings, we include training on journalistic safety practices and some of these issues that you're talking about. And also we talk about source safety, both journalistic issues and also source safety, because of course, if you can be hacked, you know, then you also can have, you might have images that can be stolen and might be revealing very personal data about somebody who is not open or not out in their LGBTQ identity to their family or out publicly. You know, if you're interviewing somebody, for instance, these sources will almost always request anonymity. So, you know, there are a number of ways, and there are organizations that work with journalists and have developed different tools and things like that to try to both protect journalists, protect their sources, and also help them figure out when an account is fake or when an account is real and verify the information. It's very complicated, and as you know, and when you're dealing with journalists who are not familiar, you know, haven't been trained professionally, sometimes it takes a while for them to learn all of these techniques. But definitely all of the social media companies have all thrown in a lot of money. Facebook, Twitter, not so much Twitter, I will say, but Facebook and Google particularly, to a lesser extent Microsoft, they have all donated millions and millions of dollars to try to train journalists as to how to identify fake accounts, identify false information, and how to verify factual information via social media accounts. So it's a constant battle, right? Because as soon as you figure out one way to battle the creeps, they figure out another way to get in, and so on. So it's a never-ending process, and it's exhausting to do it all the time and to do it well. But your point is, it's a huge important point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, does anybody else have a question? Thank you, Abdul. And we want to thank you, Dr. Mason, for your time and all the good work you're doing. And we just want to encourage you to keep up the good work. And I hope you get to go on your trip in the fall. I hope it's
I hope so.
And keep in touch with the Africa Hub and let us know how you're doing. And we're planning to do the next Focus on Africa. It's going to be on the April the 15th, and George Sharanande, he was here as a guest. He's going to present. His topic is, he's actually a Fulbright Science and Technology Fellow, specializing in nuclear and biological engineering. And the title of his presentation is going to be America, EU, and the BRICS, Misadventures and Disconnects in Global Health Research. And that'll be at the same time, 12 to 1:30 on Zoom Media. And we're going to post that Zoom link on our Facebook. It's Africa Hub on Facebook. And thank you so much. And we really appreciate everyone and value your time today. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Thanks, Debra.
Thank you. All righty. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.